there are signs the country needs emergency federal relief before the end of the year. Cases, hospitalizations, deaths are rising. COVID restrictions are snapping back into place in cities and states around the country. Economists are warning of a double-dip recession if Congress fails to pass another round of fiscal stimulus. The situation is really quite simple. There are glaring needs in the country, and we will need to work across party lines to pass legislation to meet those needs. Let me say it again, we need both parties to sit down and compromise on legislation to help the American people. That's the only way to get legislation passed. But observers of this process seem to have lost track of this simple truth. The Republican leader seems to have forgotten about it entirely. Amazingly, it's been over 8 months since Congress came together to pass the CARES Act, and the leader's position has not budged. The majority leader continues to insist that the Senate accept one of his partisan Republican proposals, each one of which has been sorely inadequate, and each of which has contained poison pills designed to ensure the bill's failure. The most conspicuous of these poison pills is the so-called red line the majority leader has tried to draw on the issue of corporate immunity. Contrary to the majority leader's dire predictions, there has been no flood of COVID lawsuits. In fact, quite the opposite. Almost a year into this pandemic, with nearly 15 million Americans infected, 280,000 lives lost to COVID-19, there have only been 111 COVID-related lawsuits filed regarding conditions of employment, 23 suits for personal injury from exposure to the coronavirus in a public place, and 11 COVID-related medical malpractice suits. Far from a pandemic of lawsuits, there has barely been a trickle. And yet the Republican leader continues to prevent Americans from getting the aid they so desperately need and deserve until he gets this piece of partisan ideological legislation. Again yesterday, while the leader was busy accusing Democrats of blocking, quote, bipartisan legislation that, quote, everyone agrees on, his words, other members of the Republican leadership were making it clear that Leader McConnell continues to insist on this particular poison pill. The Republican whip said that any relief must have corporate immunity that, quote, satisfy Senator McConnell. Imagine holding emergency aid hostage, help for the unemployed, help for small businesses, help to pay salaries of police and firefighters, help for individual Americans, funding to deliver a vaccine, in order to give corporations legal immunity. But that has been the Republican position for the past 8 months, and it is the leader's position today. For the sake of bipartisan negotiations, Republican leadership should forsake these hardline positions. You can't claim to want bipartisanship while actively demanding the Senate accept partisan legislation. Bipartisan does not mean Democrats must agree to whatever the Republican leader wants on whatever issue he picks. Bipartisan means both sides sitting down, finding agreement to meet the needs of the country and make a law. That process is happening with the Gang of Eight. It should continue until we get a solution. On the FCC, the Senate will also vote on the nomination of Nathan Symington, a Republican nominee to the FCC. Normally, these nominations to independent boards and commissions are paired, one Democrat, one Republican, to keep balance on the board. But here, in the waning days of a lame duck presidency, the Republican majority is rushing to approve a single Republican nominee. The nominee himself is far from uncontroversial. Mr. Symington's key qualification seems to be that he supports President Trump's desired changes to Section 230, a law that regulates Internet speech. In fact, it appears that he severely misled senators on the Commerce Committee when he told them, while working for a federal agency, he played only an administrative role in his department's petition for the repeal of Section 230. It turns out Mr. Symington was not only pushing the petition himself, he was actively lobbying Fox News to support it. for political reasons. I strongly urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to reject Mr. Symington's nomination to the FCC. And finally, Madam President, as we approach the end of the Senate session, I have the unhappy task of bidding farewell to senators who will be concluding their time in this chamber. Within an hour, our friend, our dear friend, and dear colleague, Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico, will give his final speech here on the Senate floor. For the past 12 years, senators have been lucky to work with a legislator of Senator Udall's caliber, someone who possesses a mastery of public policy, who is practical as well as principled. You always know where Senator Udall stands on an issue, but you also know he's always willing to sit with you and work with you until you find common ground. And because of these qualities, Tom will leave this chamber as a supremely accomplished legislator, a fierce defender of the environment, and a true champion of the American West. Now, a lot of politicians get described as wunderkinds for getting elected at a young age, but you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who got their start in politics earlier than Tom. He made his debut at the plucky age of 5, hoisting campaign signs from the back of his family's convertible during his dad's first bid for Congress. Public service runs deep in the veins of a Udall. It might be called the sap of the Udall family tree. Alongside his father, Tom looked up to his Uncle Mo, who succeeded his father in Congress and ran for president as one of his generation's great environmental advocates. Not too long ago, the Senate roll call featured 2 Udalls, Tom and cousin Mark. Even now, our colleague from Utah, Senator Lee, is a second cousin of the Udall clan. But ultimately, it was Tom's dad who taught him a lifelong love of the political process. During the years Stuart Udall served as Interior Secretary, Tom would watch from the living room as his dad sat at the dinner table, surrounded by Democrats and Republicans alike, both sides at dinner working together. Those memories left a mark. And Tom would spend his time in Congress trying to do much the same. Tom's work with Senator Vitter led to one of his greatest accomplishments in office, the first major revision of the Toxic Substances Control Act in 40 years. At the time, it was the most significant environmental law to pass Congress in over 20 years. Tom also had become one of the Senate's leading authorities on tribal policy, co-sponsoring over a quarter of the bills that passed through the Indian Affairs Committee on their way to being signed into law. Legislation to improve tribal access to affordable health care, and funding to support Native American language preservation programs and boost support for Native American entrepreneurs all bear the Udall stamp. And when it comes to protecting our environment and public lands, no one commands greater respect than the senior senator from New Mexico. Tom helped increase funding for the Department of Interior by 25%, including billions to protect our national parks and expand our wildlife preserves. Through the Great American Outdoors Act, Tom helped secure permanent funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, a fund his dad helped establish over 40 years ago. One of Tom's favorite authors, Wallace Stegner, once wrote, "Something will have gone out of us as a people if we ever let the remaining wilderness be destroyed. We simply need that wild country available to us, even if we never do more than drive to its edge and look in." Well, Tom did a whole lot more than look in. He preserved, he conserved, he expanded the great American wilderness for generations hence. These highlights, impressive as they are only the tip of the iceberg. Over his 12 years in office, Tom's legislative accomplishments ran the gamut of consumer protection, conservation policy, climate change, the protection of tribal nations, and most recently, a principled stand against the current administration's attempts to roll back critical environmental protections. And through it all, Tom has been unendingly civil, decent, kind. He has deep friendships, real friendships, long-lasting friendships in our caucus and across the aisle. He prefers to solve problems, no matter who gets the credit, sometimes resisting the urge to make a splash in public. Kidding aside, Tom is as down-to-earth as they come. There's just no artifice about him. He's a decent senator, and as a man, you couldn't find any better. Other senators will attest to these qualities, I'm sure. So will his staff, a tribute that's perhaps even greater. The respect and loyalty that Senator Udall commands from those who work for him day in and day out is something extraordinary. We don't know when a Udall will next grace the halls with their presence, these halls with their presence. But I do know this: the country needs more leaders like Tom. Senator Udall once said his father and his uncle were lifelong role models because they had the right mix of inspiration and perspiration. He said, quote, "They were both visionaries, but they were also doers." I can think of no better description of Tom Udall himself. A visionary, but also a doer. Tom, as you move on to the next chapter in your life, I wish you and Jill the very best of luck on the road ahead. I yield the floor.